Should.
Well, time now for our political panel for this Monday afternoon. Joining me in the studio, Liberal Senator Holly Hughes, and from Perth, Greens Senator Dorinda Cox. Welcome to both of you. Holly Hughes, I want to start with you because you've got a new boss today, Peter Dutton.
I do have a new boss and a new deputy leader, but in the Senate we have maintained both Simon Birmingham and Michaelia Cash in their roles as they were before the election.
Certainly have done. There's a lot of conjecture about what a Liberal Party under Peter Dutton will look like, whether or not it will amount to a even greater shift to the right for the party. Based on prior experience, what can you say about Peter Dutton's leadership that suggests he won't be doing that?
Look, I've known Peter for around 15 years, and I think perhaps his public persona versus what he's like in private are very, very different. He is someone who was always very effective, was always very supportive. Whenever I went to him with an issue, something that had to be dealt with, he was incredibly responsive, as well as being supportive. Even in the, recently in the last term of Parliament, I did a lot of work obviously around autism. One of the biggest autism early learning intervention centres is in his seat, and he was very supportive of the work that I was doing there in trying to support that organisation. So he's very effective. I think there's a lot of people that are nervous about how effective he will be, but he's a very, very capable leader, and I think he will ensure that the Liberal Party stays very true to its centre-right values.
This is a man who's been in Parliament, though, for 2 decades. Everyone keeps saying that he's X, Y and Z behind the scenes. Why hasn't that ever come across?
Look, I think when you look at the portfolios that he's held, they have been particularly tough portfolios, whether it's home affairs or defence. There has been that a very strong and serious focus that perhaps you're not going to see Mr Warm and Fuzzy out there when you're dealing with issues like home affairs, national security, Operation Sovereign Borders and defence industry.
For a while as well.
Yeah, he was in health, but health is also a very serious portfolio. I mean, every portfolio is serious, but there's certainly, some of those are the biggest portfolios with very, very big budget impacts. But if we want to talk about, Anthony Albanese was in Parliament for 26 years before being elected Prime Minister, and one of the feedback that was coming through constantly was no one knew who he was. So I think, sometimes ministers and backbenchers, not a lot of the Australian the public actually engage with who a lot of those people are.
Dorinda Cox, I want to bring you in here. You've been in Parliament only for a short period of time now, but you have been in Parliament. You've seen how it all works. You've no doubt seen Peter Dutton in full flight before. What do you think a Peter Dutton leadership of the Liberal Party under Peter Dutton, what do you think that's going to be like in Parliament?
Well, I think Mr Dutton will continue his divisive nature, and we've just heard that through the language today, particularly around making a mistake, being on a unity ticket with First Nations people in this country. They're all divisive language, and boycotting the apology was quite a significant issue and a very, very public stance in relation to that. Glad to hear that he's been on a learning curve, but I don't hold any hope that that's actually going to provide any collaboration in the work going forward, particularly for the Liberal Party. We've also seen that with the African gangs and the divisive language they used, but also jokes about, our Pacific neighbours and the water that's been lapping at their doorstep, and them asking for 2 decades of the politicians, and particularly of the Liberal Party, to ask for urgent climate action. I think that this will continue to be a narrative that the Liberal Party will continue under Peter Dutton.
So you don't think that there's any scope for Peter Dutton to, admit there's been issues in the past and adapt his leadership style now? A leopard can't change its spots, is effectively your argument there.
No, I don't think there is, and I think that we will just see much of the same.
So what would you be hoping for? I mean, the Greens are in a position now where they're going to be holding a much more significant share of voice in the federal parliament. Do you hold out any hope that under a Peter Dutton leadership that there would be any discussions happening between the two parties?
Well, I would hope that there would be definitely some listening, some more collaboration. We are going to see in the 47th Parliament our biggest injection of First Nations or Indigenous parliamentarians coming into the place. We hope that there will be lots of listening from the Liberal Party. Sad to see the departure of former Minister Ken Wyatt. I know that he didn't have much support within his own party room to take forward some of those reforms that he was hoping to get across the line during his time in the Parliament. But I hope that during our time in the 47th Parliament that we will have much more listening, much more collaboration and much more consultation, because that is what we heard from the Australian Greens perspective, that the Australian public want more of those politics. They want us to work collaboratively on the outcomes that are important to Australians, not the divisive politics that they've seen of the past.
Holly Hughes, I mean, the Greens have picked up seats. You've got a whole swag of independents now. Is there going to have to be a more collaborative approach in the 47th Parliament, regardless of which of the parties we're talking about? Is there going to have to be much more cooperation, do you think?
Look, I think what we're going to see, and hopefully we will see, and I know this is going to sound a bit strange, but that Labor will be able to govern in a majority government. When you look at particularly these teal independents who've come in and where they're coming from, these aren't people who understand disadvantaged Australians. These aren't people who understand people in New South Wales out in the regions, or people out in Western Sydney who might be experiencing mortgage stress. I mean, we heard from the new member for North Sydney, Kylie Tink, that she wanted a congestion tax for people to come in to the city or to North Sydney. We're not talking about some of the people in Wentworth going to the petrol station and only putting $20 or $30 of petrol in their car because that's all they can afford. We've got very, very different perspectives. So I think it's dangerous if that Labor has to negotiate with the Teals, because they don't understand disadvantaged Australians. They don't understand Australians who are doing it tough, and they have very little interest in those Australians when you look at the very privileged seats that they represent.
But doesn't the fact that so many voters, through their support behind the Teal independents, through their support behind the Greens, which obviously Senator Cox is a member of, show that they didn't think that the Liberals also represented those ideals?
Well, you know, it's when the dust settles, there'll be a review and we'll have a look at where that lands. We do have a new leader, we have a new deputy leader, we'll have a new team in place by the end of the week, and the Liberal Party will start to review why that happened, why that occurred in some of those seats, how we're going to rebuild that trust and go back into those seats where we have always been traditionally strong Liberal seats. So we do need to rebuild, and I think perhaps bringing together a new team will allow us to do that into the future.
Dorinda Cox, the Greens obviously thrilled with its electoral performance. I think it's safe to describe it in that fashion. But if Anthony Albanese is able to get 76 seats in the lower house and can govern in majority, does it mean that the influence, or doesn't it mean that the influence of the Greens and those independents is considerably diminished as a result?
I don't believe so. I think that we will still work collaboratively with the incoming government and with the incoming Labor Party under Mr Albanese, and I think that, and that includes the work that we will do in the crossbench of the Senate. So I'm not convinced that this will water down our ability to influence and our ability to make change that is urgently required, particularly when we are talking about climate action and we are talking about the inequality. And you know, I think that that's what the Australian public actually needs at this time in our Parliament.
I want to pick up on, and you alluded to it just briefly, what Peter Dutton had been saying about the apology to the stolen generations and what you think that would mean for work to enshrine Indigenous Australians in the Constitution, to create a voice to Parliament. How damaging, and we've heard from Linda Burney, she wants to get bipartisanship on this issue. How difficult is that going to be to achieve, and how damaging will it be if you can't get bipartisanship on that issue?
Well, I think it is critical that we get bipartisan agreement on this issue in order to move forward. I think the agreement is it's long overdue and that we actually need to move forward with this, and I agree with Linda Burney wholeheartedly on that issue, and we will work to progress all components of the Uluru Statement of the Heart. And as we've previously said, and my leader Adam Bant has always echoed, that we were one of the first signatories and agreeants with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and we will continue to work with the incoming government on progressing all parts of that. But unless we have bipartisanship and true, you know, pathway to making this happen, I think we will see it fail, and that will be unfortunate. I do also think that we need to continue to work in educating people on what those different components are and the importance of those different areas.
Holly Hughes, I do want to ask you the same issue. I mean, this is something that there were reservations within the coalition under the stewardship of the former Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken White, about how this approach would go forward. Does the Liberal Party have to accept that it's lost the election, and that therefore Labor does have a mandate for things like progressing its adoption of the statement from the heart?
Look, I'm not quite sure we can call 33% of the vote across the nation a mandate for this incoming Labor government.
Still potentially a majority.
It is still potentially a majority government, but it is a 32 to 33% vote across the country. So we are still talking 68% or so of Australians didn't vote for the Labor Party. So we're not talking an overwhelming majority mandate here that the Labor Party has. I mean, I'll pick up what Senator Cox was just saying, that we now have more First Nations people coming into this parliament than ever before. Parliament is the voice of the Australian electorate. I noticed that both Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price, both Indigenous First Nations people themselves, expressing some concerns around this becoming a bureaucratic nightmare as opposed to addressing the needs. And there are some very, very pressing needs in Indigenous communities. One of the things that we are going to see with the removal of the cashless debit card, which Labor has vowed with the support of the Greens to scrap, when I've sat on many a committee that's gone out and looked at this, where communities were grateful for the cashless debit card, and particularly women, because the instance of humbugging, of people harassing them to take their social security welfare payments off them, meant that they were able to provide food for their families, school supplies for their kids. That money was not able to be used to purchase things like alcohol. Now we're taking away that safety net for a lot of women and children in these Indigenous communities. And so I'm more concerned about seeing things occur that benefit those women and children, rather than someone asking a question about it or not getting 100% behind it, and all of a sudden they're a racist. That is where this will fall down. We have Lydia Thorpe in the Senate. Her behaviour is an abomination most of the time. And if she's to continue speaking to a number of us in the way that she continues to do so, I can't see how anyone's going to collaborate across that. And her insistence that everyone who doesn't see her way is a racist is not going to win anyone any favours.
Senator Hughes, I do feel like by way of response, we do need to give Senator Cox a response to some of what Senator Hughes just said. Very briefly, though, we are running out of time very quickly.
Yeah, I think that that all sides of government, come to that place, and the Senate is the place of the people. And I think I said this during my first speech, that we all come with the want and with the need to be able to represent our constituents and make sure that we are taking forward all of the issues that are a priority to people. I think that, I agree with Senator Hughes in relation to some of the behaviour and the code of conduct, particularly politicians in Parliament. And I think you referenced that I have only been there for a very short time, and some of the behaviour that I've seen does need to be corrected, and it's not just one-sided. So I think that there is a great need for us to continue to look at workplace issues, the Jenkins Review and other things that make it safe for all women in the Parliament, but also making sure that we follow a code of conduct that is appropriate for everyone. And I think that we all agree First Nations issues are a priority in this country, and as I said before, we will be working in collaboration with the Labor Party and hopefully with the Coalition as well, now that they're in opposition, to actually progress all of those things.
Senator Dorinda Cox, Senator Holly Hughes, thank you for joining us on Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks, Matt. See you, Dorinda.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, Australia